Okay, hello folks. Today we're going to be looking into the politics of the Gilded Age, and we're also going to look into the populist movement, so getting into how the Gilded Age is impacting rural America. Again, this lecture might feature a guest star, one of my other cats. She's a little bit special needs, and sometimes she likes to meow sort of loud, so we'll see how that goes. In any event, here we go. So again, our focus is going to be on rural America first. As we talked about in previous videos, one of the things about the Gilded Age that's really important to consider is all of these technological innovations. And so those had an impact on agriculture as well. Increasingly, not only do farmers depend on mechanized agriculture, so new things like mechanical plows, they also are depending more and more on the evolving railroad system. So they are creating local and regional organizations that seek to resist corporate control of agricultural markets. So we're seeing a similar labor reaction to the rising wealth and income gap during the Gilded Age. These farmers' organizations brought them together to both promote their economic and political interests. So again, we're seeing a lot of connections to some of the more urban labor movements that we previously discussed. And in a lot of Midwestern states, there were some farmer-friendly laws passed in the 1860s and early 1870s. In general, those laws were aimed at regulating railroads. So those railroads often rose to be either real monopolies or oligopolies, which is where just a few companies are at the top. So you can only imagine how rural America reacted to that. If you were a farmer and you didn't make much money, you tended to resist the control that railroads had over your economic livelihood because they could fix prices to whatever rate folks were able or willing to pay. And some farmers very much struggled to be able to afford the unstable prices that railroads would charge, especially when farmers also had to deal with unstable prices of their own crops. Okay, so again, farmers start to organize. So at first, these organizations are a little bit more informal and a little bit more local. So in the 1870s and 1880s, we start to see farmer organizations. Again, they're supporting things like government regulation of railroads. They also want some sort of form of income tax, and also they want the government to help control the unstable rate of currency. In general, they want the government to respond to inflation, again, to help them. So we also see that these movements are not always entirely inclusive. A lot of these local farmers' alliances were segregating folks based on race. So we did see that African American farmers started to form their own farmers' alliances as well. And we also see discrimination against, there we go, sorry, Cece. So in any event, we do also see organization of Spanish-speaking farmers, particularly an interesting example to zoom in on here. This organization, La Gorras Blancas, was a Spanish-speaking organization in New Mexico that was actually underground. And they did so because they feared retaliation from the local, state, and maybe even national governments. What they were fighting against was the encroachment of Anglo-Americans on the land that they thought was promised to them, in particular after the Mexican-American War, when although those generations were, at first, they were born as Mexican nationals, some of them did gain their U.S. citizenship, but yet they were still at risk of losing their land. But it is, again, interesting to just note that they were operating in secret. So in a political sense, we do see that farmers are increasingly starting again to band together. And this is where we see this amalgamation of different farmers' alliances start to organize into what's called the People's Party, aka the Populist Party. And what they are calling for is political reform. And again, stronger government role in the American economic system. This political party is largely comprised of farmers both in the South and the Midwest. And again, what brings them together is that they're hurt by debt, unstable currency rates, low prices for their crops, and railroad monopolies or oligopolies. And in the election 1892, the political platform, which is basically like the policymaking agenda of the Populist Party, called for all these things that you see over here to the right. And in class, if you're one of my students, we zeroed in on this really, I think, interesting. I wanted to get the pointer going, but Anyway, a really, really interesting poster that shows us maybe some comparisons to some of the posters that we saw when we studied China in Global Studies 2. If you had me, well, rather, I didn't teach sophomores last year, but when you took Global Studies 2, if you studied that, these may ring a bell. In any event, let's look at currency, because this is also a major political issue in the late 19th century. So the book mentions the gold standard. I think it does a pretty good job of explaining it, but in case you're still confused, currency, paper currency, is backed in some sort of more standard weight of gold during this time period, and that's called the gold standard. And because, again, interest rates are fluctuating, there's inflation, there's also pressure to deflate the value of currency. There was also this movement, largely adopted and embraced by the populists, to actually use a silver standard for coins. And that movement was called the Free Silver Movement. What folks actually wanted was to inflate the American economy and allow farmers to more easily pay off their debts. So in the election of 1896, the populist and Democratic Party candidate, interesting that he was on both those tickets, was William Jennings Bryan. And he gave a very famous speech called Cross of Gold, where he criticized the gold standard and favored the free silver movement. And this attracted a lot of support, again, from the populists in the South and West, and also the Democrats, who in general were supported more by rural voters. And again, feel free to look at this political cartoon and think about who might want to vote for someone like William Jennings Bryan based on some of the symbols that you see here. We already discussed Eugene V. Debs in a previous video regarding his role in the Pullman strike. Now I want to shift to look at his political role, because he was very influential and is still influential to this day. So if you don't remember from previous classes, or if you haven't studied socialism yet, if you're not one of my students, just really broadly, socialism is a system where workers believe that they should have more control over the economic systems that they exist in, right? So they believe that the government also should play a heavy role in regulating things like monopolies and also providing more protection for workers. So again, we could get much more into that. Feel free to ask further questions. Just know that the American version of socialism does stand in contrast to something like Marxist-Leninism in 1917 Russia, in the sense that they did believe that this should be a democratic process. Eugene V. Debs ran for office. He did not attempt to seize power in some sort of coup. So it is important for us to distinguish those two things, especially when we're trying to understand the resurgence of modern socialism in the turn of the 21st century. More on that in a moment. So in any event, Debs was not only a labor activist, he was also a very well-regarded and respected speaker among his supporters. He ended up getting arrested at least 2 different times for his participation in national railroad strikes. Oh, and one other time, and this is the most famous time he was arrested, for speaking out against American involvement and the draft in World War I. And he ended up actually running for president many different times around the turn of the 20th century, rather. And he received in between 3 and 6% of the popular vote in those elections, which is a fairly decent margin considering that the Socialist Party was never a mainstream party. And what's really interesting is at least once he was imprisoned when he ran for president. And you can see at the lower left here, this was a button to support his campaign. So for president, convict number 9653. And also, again, I'm not going to get into the details here. In class, we did look at some quotes comparing some of Bernie Sanders' ideas at the turn of the 21st century to Debs's ideas. And although, of course, Sanders has adopted more modern causes like college and healthcare, there's clearly an influence. And Bernie Sanders has very, very clearly stated that many of his ideas are inspired by the ideas of Eugene V. Debs. So just to wrap things up here, I think it's important for us to just pause and think about our previous understandings of more rural a rather urban American labor that we looked at earlier and these new developments in rural America. We're not quite finished with Gilded Age politics. We're going to come back to this concept called machine party politics in the near future. But I think that for the most part, you should have a good overview of not only the politics of the Gilded Age, but the labor of the Gilded Age, different economic changes, and some of the things that are going to pave the way for the progressive era, which is coming soon.